Patch version 0.18 is recently dropped and has shaken up Predecessor in some massive ways. Major changes to economy and experience gain, drastic changes to the pacing and playstyle of jungle, as well as a colossal pool of hero balance changes, all adding up to massive character tier changes. With this being such an insanely huge patch, I took a bit of extra time to make this list. It honestly still isn't perfect. I haven't been able to play every character in every role enough to make a perfectly fair assessment, but using my extensive experience and knowledge in Predecessor, I'll do my best to evaluate and rate every character from the depths of C tier up to the throne of Paragon. My name is Bad News Bears. This is Predecessor version 0.18 tier list. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. While most tanks find themselves left in the dark this patch, one tank in particular gets to hold his spot on the throne, with buffs to his entire kit. Quang, proving to remain one of the most potent offlaners this patch, has received a 2 base damage buff, as well as a 1 additional extra damage buff per level to his passive. Judgment of the Heavens gets a significant flat damage buff and a 10% scaling buff. Surge of the Heavens receives an early game flat damage buff. Light of the Heavens gets a buff to its base damage, as well as the true damage when the sword is out in the world, plus additional flat shield while the sword is in hand. Quang's ultimate, Fear of the Heavens, sees a flat damage buff and 10% additional scaling. While tank items are out of favor, Quang getting some additional scalings lets him get more value from some more bruiser options, allowing items like Tainted Scepter, World Breaker, and the reworked Magnify into his build. In the lane phase, the slight nerfs to Fire Blossom are easily mitigated by the flat increase to his damage across the board. They say lightning never strikes in the same place twice, well whoever said that never met Quang, who finds himself in Paragon tier. Aurora is the newest hero coming into Predecessor, so where does she find herself? With a very unique kit, Aurora can use her wall to set a massive pick place and separate enemy teammates mid-fight. Outside of her wall, she's rather lackluster. Her root is a decent ability, but nothing crazy, as it's easy to avoid with any jump. Even some new items make avoiding the root trivial. She has a close range slow that does a decent amount of damage, but being a tank with no hard CC outside of her ultimate's questionable. Even her ultimate does leave a lot to be desired. The range isn't amazing, and enemies have a window to make space before the stun effect takes place, but at its peak, it can be devastating. Even then, with lackluster engage, her ultimate isn't even that easy to get off in a great position. Her lane phase is one of the safest in the game, with her wall being a great disengage tool and some solid self-peel CC, but once lane phase is over, she's super exposed for her weaknesses. I do think good Aurora players will be able to do some solid work with the character, but she does have a bit of a skill requirement. All this said, I do believe Aurora would typically be A tier, but I'll put her in S because she is one of the few decent tanks right now. Moving into the offlane tier list, Greystone moves up to S tier after his massive buffs, joining Aurora, Grux, and Xeris. Crunch falls a bit this patch as other laners received significant buffs or new items, while Crunch remains stagnant for the most part, and with Mutilator taking a big hit, Crunch finds himself in A tier with Feng Mao, Shinbi, and Seraph. Tanks are on the fall, Sevarog and Steel drop down to B tier. While still being viable and can do a great job supporting the team, it'll be rare that one of these two ever wins you the game. A newcomer to offlane tier list, Chimera joins up in the B tier. An unconventional pick in the offlane, but with a sea of buffs and itemization changes, Chimera can easily use his power to bully lane advantage matchups versus notable laners like Greystone, Aurora, or Quang. Rounding off the C tier, we have Richter, Countess, and Kallari. None of these three characters are going to provide a whole lot for your team unless you are a Kallari or Countess one-trick. Chimera receives some hefty buffs this patch, with his passive giving him additional health regen and movement speed, 10% more basic attack bonus power scaling, 5% on the total power scaling, as well as 5% more cleave damage on Unleash, Ambush seeing a 5% buff to its slow, and his ultimate Cull receiving significant increase to its damage at level 1. Items such as Kingsbane, Berserker's Axe, and Basilisk help provide Chimera with one of the quickest and healthiest jungle clears in the game. Great jungle boss clear speed, as well as great early game invade and gank potential, all capped off with a good transition to late game with options like Draconum. Pretty much every aspect of this update is all working in Chimera's favor right now. With these buffs and items in combination with the jungle changes, we see Chimera shoot up to the top of the tier list at Paragon. Rampage isn't so lucky this patch, failing to keep up with his title of King of the Jungle. While Rampage did see slight damage buffs to Boulder Throw, Rumble was nerfed, losing 5% of its physical scaling. With changes to jungle, slow clear's not really an option. Crest changes and current item balance leave Rampage with either a slow tank build, risking falling too far behind, or a suboptimal build leaving him a bit more damage oriented, but not being on par with other naturally tanky junglers, who can also augment into bruiser builds like Chimera, Greystone, or Crunch. Thankfully, Rampage is saved a bit due to his mobility and Boulder Toss still being one of the strongest single non-ultimate CC abilities in the game. Because of this, he's sitting a bit higher than his other tank jungler friends, the not-so-king of the jungles landing in B tier this time around. Moving on to the jungle tier list, we have some interesting moves with Greystone, Seraph, and Grux, who surged in value going into this new patch. Greystone seeing massive buffs, while Seraph and Grux got new items and added value from the pacing of jungle, so they'll be joining Xerath and Quang in S tier. The newest member of the roster, Aurora, finds herself in A tier, while her engage is subpar. Being a tank with decent clear will take you a long way in jungle right now. Feng Mao and Kalari also find their way into A tier. Both assassins are very strong, but jungle struggles to keep up in experience right now, so anything below exceptional play will put you behind, spelling disaster for these two assassins. They are joining Aurora, Shinbi, and Crunch in the A tier. Countess is joining Rampage in the B tier. And the three true tanks, Steel, Sevarog, and Richter, are struggling to adapt to the new jungle changes, and with nerfs to Fire Blossom leaving them stranded in the C tier. Howie walked out of version 0.18 living the good life. I thought he was a strong mid lane going into this patch, and he somehow came out even better. Howie's passive Arm Salvo got a slight 5 damage buff. R2000 received an early game damage buff and mana cost decrease. Landmines seeing an early game damage buff as well. Slow grenades are getting a significant buff with an extra 10 base damage at all levels, 2 extra damage for additional grenade hits, and mana cost decrease. With all these changes to Howie's kit alone, he can stay in lane longer and poke you even harder than he was before. With Mage Crests getting ability haste, Howie is able to dish out damage more frequently and at no cost, and stays safer with a reduced cooldown on his ultimate and mine. Soulbinder being added to the game is a bonus treat for Howie, giving his long-range abilities 8% bonus damage and easy-to-stack free magical power, as well as 15 ability haste, opening a flat pen as easy build options. Howie's been gifted gold this patch, moving him all the way up to Paragon tier. Morgus received a bit of love this patch. While her passive Pestilence saw a slight nerf to its scaling, Hive did get a mana cost reduction, letting her wave clear be a bit less costly. Swarm got a buff to its heal, allowing her to more reliably sustain in lane phase against some of her worst matchups. Mark received a flat damage buff at all levels, allowing for a more potent short trade window in lane, and her ultimate curse saw a significant flat 50 damage buff at level 1, that falls off to a flat 10 damage buff at level 3. However, it also saw a 5% scaling increase. Changes to Morgish's ultimate help ensure those early game kills and really solidify her Mark ult combo to one-shot enemies in late game. While Morg can struggle in the early game, a solid understanding of matchup and trade windows along with buffs to her sustain should be enough to help you get through a shaky early game and transition into an insanely dominant late game. Mage itemization is incredibly strong right now, turning Morgish into a one-man wrecking crew. With Destructive Force this strong, she finds herself in S tier. The mid lane tier list sees quite the shakeup this patch, as Gadget flies up the tier list after seeing damage buffs across the board, as well as strong itemizations with the newly buffed Azure core. Gadget is joining Gideon, Morgish, and Grim in the S tier. Both Bellica and Argus have been taken back a few steps, not hitting as hard as they used to, but their CC still makes them a valuable member of any team. They find themselves in A tier. With mages being all the rage this patch, Wraith finds himself in B tier, joining Shinbi and Faye. Assassins and mid just don't hold up in the current build, so Countess finds herself along with Decker in C tier. While I did place Iggy in the B tier, the community is heavily backing the character, so I feel like I may have misplaced him. With tanks not walking out of 0.18 too hot, one particular Enchanter support is on the rise. Muriel got buffs across the board this patch with bonus damage on her passive Sentinel and her primary Serenity. Consecrated Ground got a 40 flat damage buff and 40 flat shield buff at max level. Alacrity got a 5% buff to its attack speed stim, a 50% flat shield buff at max level, and 5% more magical scaling. With these damage buffs, Muriel is able to out-trade in lane a bit more convincingly, and outside of lane she can still split push and be impactful away from the team, while always only being a second away with her game-changing ultimate. Everbloom coming into the game has Muriel's team loving her even more now, as she's able to provide damage mitigation and tenacity. Muriel was split pushing the lower ranks for a while, but now she's used her ult to rotate all the way up to Paragon. The not-so-little Drummer Boy remains as one of the premier supports in Predecessor, even receiving some slight buffs this patch, with extra damage on his autos, 5% more cleave damage on those autos, more healing on Song of My People, Thunk getting a little extra shot of damage, and Crash Bang Boom also gaining more flat damage. These buffs were rather small, and ultimately done, I think, to keep him feeling the same with the overall changes to the game. Narbash is as useful now as he was going into version 0.18. He's an insane multi-target healer, able to grant his team arguably the best stat in the game, which is movement speed, allowing for easy engage or a hasty retreat. While his ultimate is somewhat inconsistent, the rest of his kit more than makes up for that one shortcoming. From personal experience, games just feel easier when you have a Narbash in support. Narb gets to bang his drums in Paragon tier. As we look into the support tier list, a rare occurrence where we see two heroes hold Paragon tier together with Muriel and Narbash in those spots. While tanks are on the fall, Richter sits in his hit hook win game situation, so he still sits in S tier along with FaZe, who pairs well with high tier self peel lacking ADCs like Sparrow and Grim. Steel, Decker, and Argus are all individually doing their jobs well, but don't do them well enough to be excited about. They all find themselves in A tier. Bellica, Grux, and Xeris all get to hang out in B, as they're all viable supports, and even given in the right situation can all be a menace. It's just about drafting them at the right time. And C tier is completely empty this patch. It's hard to go wrong when picking a support in version 0.18. Murdoch was already a fairly strong ADC, but after buffs, his power is undeniable. Murdoch's passive, Shots Fired, now gives him an additional 5% pen, bringing the total up to 35. With a high attack speed build, tanks fold like paper around him. Static Trap also gets a rather significant flat damage buff of 70 at max level and 20% additional bonus physical power scaling, making traps no longer a laughing matter. Buckshot, getting flat power and an additional 10% scaling, makes this shotgun feel like a freight train to the chest, and his ultimate, Long Arm of the Law, also receives both a flat damage buff and a 10% scaling buff. With all these changes, Murdoch chews through the competition, being a shockingly strong counter to tanks, and Chimera, who he particularly spaces well. Even when not dealing with tanks, Murdoch's passive, giving him extra range, and Buckshot allows him to easily space nearly all physical champions. The key factor separating Murdoch from Grim in this tier list is his mobility from Stimpack. Murdoch outruns and outguns his competition, finding himself in Paragon tier. Our tall king may have been taken down a few pegs in size, but his viability has shot up to new heights. The decrease in Grim's hitbox size and increase in movement speed makes him much more maneuverable in fights. On top of this, his Displacement Blast got both a flat damage increase and 10% bonus physical power scaling increase. Grim's ultimate, GTFO, also sees a 10% scaling increase and a shift in base damage, allowing for a stronger level 1 ultimate. There is no ADC that matches the amount of damage Grim can do, the issue being he still has 0 mobility and does not gain value from typical pen items like Demolisher. If Grim wasn't so easy to lock down, he would be Paragon tier for sure, but for now, our mini fridge is sitting comfortably in S tier. Moving into the ADC tier list, Grim finds himself alone at the top of S tier, while Sparrow sees her damage on par with Grim and Murdoch. Her lack of any self-peel and lack of long-range ultimate puts her a bit lower, ending in A tier along with Twin Blast and Drongo, who can on their own utilize on-hit well, but just don't hit quite as hard as some of the other champs in the role. With on-hit being the go-to this patch, Wraith doesn't sit too favorably, but his potent ultimate lands him in the B tier alongside a freshly nerfed Kira. Finally, alone in the C tier is Revenant. With crit being nerfed, a man whose entire state of play is dependent on how hard he can crit, he is not living the good life. If I made a D tier for these tier lists, Rev would have slid down a whole extra rank past C into D. That's the end of the tier list. Thank you guys for checking out the video. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you think. You know, maybe you're a really big Iggy stan, you think Iggy's S tier. Let me hear it. Maybe you disagree with like the Grims. I know there's some I feel like some kind of hot takes in this patch, but the more I've played this patch, the more I'm like, maybe not. This is coming out so close to another patch, and I plan to do this format. I would like to do it every patch, but maybe I can only do it every major patch. It is a bit of work to do the research and actually talk through some characters in detail. This one came out a bit late because it was such a massive patch and so much was in the air where it was so hard to judge yourself. On top of that, sending templates and doing the graphic and all that is just a lot of work basically went into this. So I hope you all liked it, and I hope you are cool with me moving forward with this format because I enjoyed making it. But I'm going to stop yapping. There's probably 2 videos on screen now. Give those a check. Like, comment, subscribe, go follow me on Twitch, and I'll see you in the next video. Bears up. Peace.